Thanks, Ron. Hello, everyone. I'm Lee Woolley. I'm the president of the Mid-Atlantic region for BNY Mellon Wealth Management. We're one of the sponsors of Geopolitics with Granary. Delighted to be associated with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and Alan and Ron, especially when we cover such important topics as we have on the agenda this evening. Although I think, every time I hear Ron speak in geopolitics with Granary, I think we've got fantastic topics out there. So pleased to be a sponsor. For those of you, I'm assuming Alan's going to talk a little bit about this, but for those of you who have not seen cartoon character Ron yet, please be on the lookout for that on the FPRI Twitter feed, Ron's Twitter feed. It's probably on the FPRI.org page, all sorts of locations. If you have not seen his cartoon character version, it is incredible. So anyway, without any further ado, I want to welcome you all and turn things over to your fearless leader, Alan Luxembourg. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. We're now doing cartoons at FPRI, and you will get an announcement tomorrow morning with all the links that you need, and it's really an exciting new initiative of the Institute. I'd like to thank the National Liberty Museum, our host and co-sponsor, and BNY Mellon Wealth Management, the Stanley and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation, and the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation for supporting the Geopolitics with Granary series. Usually, I'm going to be the guest host today for reasons that should become obvious in a moment. When we began Geopolitics with Granary 4 years ago, the title of the program was not Geopolitics with Granary, it was Firing Line 2.0, because we had meant to model it on William Buckley's firing line of many years ago, which we thought was the epitome of civil discourse conducted at a very high level of sophistication and gently combative. As soon as we announced the program 4 years ago, we heard from the producer of the original firing line, and he indicated that he intended some commercial uses still of that name, so he asked us to not use the name, and we honored that request and decided to change it to Geopolitics with Granary, recalling the perspective, the geopolitical perspective that our founder, Robert Strauss Hupé, embedded in FPRI in 1955, which required us to look at contemporary international affairs through the lens of history, geography, and culture. Only later did Ron and I realize that Buckley was both my boyhood hero and his, despite the fact that Ron and I are separated by 13 years, which goes to underscore Buckley's durability. It also means that when Buckley ran for mayor of New York City in 1965, I remember it vividly, and Ron was not yet born. Anyway, as I said, Ron is usually the host of Geopolitics with Granary, and he does a tremendous job of it, which I cannot hope to replicate here, but we thought we'd switch things around tonight and make him give the answers rather than the questions. He is executive director of our Center for the Study of America and the West and editor of our electronic publication, the American Review of Books, Blogs, and Bull. As of yesterday, as you heard, he is the animated star of our video series for students on selected topics in American governance and history. The first one covers the role of the National Security Council in American foreign policy. He is a historian of modern Europe, specializing in contemporary Germany, but he is known to have opinions on a lot of issues. Our topic tonight is conservatism in the age of Trump, and although it may turn out that our discussion will focus as much on liberalism as on conservatism as we try to define these movements or schools of thought, particularly in relation to the policies and tweets of President Trump. An alternative title for this talk might have been, what would William Buckley say? After all, he was the most important exponent of conservatism in his time. Now, before we begin, I should say that I realize people have strong feelings and great passions about some of the issues we are about to discuss. My suggestion for tonight is to put the passion away, and we'll treat with respect even those views you may not actually respect. So there will be plenty of time for questions from the audience, and if anyone feels that a certain view has not been given sufficient attention, feel free to take a couple of minutes to say so, but not more than a couple of minutes. Now, Ron, I'm mindful of the fact that you don't wear your politics on your sleeve. In fact, those who have attended all of the programs that Ron has participated in over the years are probably not even aware that he's a conservative. And in fact, I've always thought of Ron as a conservative who is always running against the grain of conservatism. So what I'll do is I'll begin by asking you, Ron, are you a conservative? What does being a conservative mean to you? And what grain of conservatism are you running against?
Well, thanks, Alan. I'm always glad to start with the easy ones. I was just thinking when you were talking like that in a sense, right? Maybe I'll steal a joke from many generations of comedians, and I'll say that at heart, maybe I'm not a conservative or a liberal, but I'm a Marxist. I'm a Groucho Marxist, right? I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member. But I think of if I had to pick a title, I would call myself conservative. Certainly, that's been my experience. You know, I'm of the generation of Generation Xers who came of age during the Reagan administration, and you know, generally speaking, if you were interested in politics, you went one way or the other, and I went one way. And so I do think of myself as a conservative, but I've also, because of my life choices, to become an academic, right? It's an interesting experience, right? Is the same opinions that can get you branded a hard right conservative as an undergraduate in Cambridge, Massachusetts, can get you branded a liberal when you're teaching at a college in Greenville, South Carolina, which I think says a lot about the wonderful variety of American political life. I think of myself as conservative in the sense that I believe that the most important thing that we can do as individuals is protect, that we have a responsibility to maintain that which has been accomplished by the people who came before us, right? That we have to show respect for that, and we have to figure out the best ways to improve upon what's come before without losing our sense of humility and responsibility for what's been bequeathed to us. So I don't want to, I'm not much of a philosopher, but I'll go with that. I will say that when I was in high school, the senior quotation I picked for the yearbook was from William F. Buckley's Up From Liberalism. And the line is, you know, I mean to live my life as an obedient man, but obedient to God and subservient to the wisdom of my ancestors, not to the authority of political truths that were arrived at yesterday at the voting booth. So I guess that's conservative. Well, that's also kind of highfalutin, which is what a highfalutin 17-year-old probably thought sounded real profound. But I think that when I think about the challenges of the conservative movement, certainly since the end of the Cold War, is what conservative politics means in the United States has become a lot of different things. And what I struggle with is an element of the conservative movement that has decided to emphasize the need to push back against institutions, to be hostile to government, hostile to universities, hostile to larger ideas of community. So a conservatism that overdoes the individualism is potentially dangerous to precisely the kinds of institutions that people who think of themselves as conservative should want to conserve.
So conservatism, you're saying, has both this individualistic quality, but yet at the same time it has always had a communitarian quality in the sense of patriotism, nationalism. So how do
Absolutely.
those two things get worked out?
I mean, it's tough because I think that especially in the United States, we're talking about, the conservatism is less a formed body of dogma than an approach to the world. When Americans, I mean, I look at the picture on the wall here at the Liberty Museum, right? Those guys there were considered, if you'd asked a conservative in 1787 what was going on the other side of the Atlantic, they would say that a bunch of dangerous fanatics had decided to challenge the existing order. That conservatism is a moving target. I'd say liberalism is a moving target too. And in the United States, right, to be a conservative is to believe that any big changes to the institutions that have been created, or any big changes to the political system that's developed in the United States, need to be approached very carefully. And that, I think, is why we have this mixture of sort of individualism and communitarianism. Right? One of the great, and this is a long tradition in American political history, right? It's because there's no established church and there is no aristocracy. Our society is built on respect for the individual and a political system that tries to encourage individual freedom in a way that other societies have had to struggle to get to. So when we're talking about conserving, right, we are conserving a version of Enlightenment liberalism that keeps us free.
So are there particular policies that should be associated with conservatism?
Well, that's a good one. I mean, since I've always been interested in foreign policy, that's how I got here. That conservatives generally should be interested, I think, in guaranteeing national security, preserving that only a society that is safe and secure can guarantee the freedom and the well-being of its citizens. I think that conservatives should want to encourage, this gets a little vague here, but I think conservatives should want to encourage social cohesion, right, in the sense that we should want to encourage a sense of belonging, so a common sense of patriotism, a common sense of citizenship. Conservatives should want that. In practice, right, we get most of the time when people get in debates about liberalism and conservatism in the U.S. these days, we're talking about how much money the government should spend on policy X or policy Y. I'm not sure that's really constructive in the sense that in the long run, right, we should view government policy at whatever level it's made, government policy according to how well it is helping the larger project of peace, prosperity, security for our citizens. So in other words, I think you can be a conservative and be in favor of Social Security, for example, which William F. Buckley was not. You can be a conservative and believe in the importance of a vibrant public education system, because conservatives should want an educated citizenry. We can talk about exactly how things get done, but conservatives should want to do a lot of things. Now, whether a room full of individual conservatives would all agree on what those things would be, that's a little harder. But of course, that's the beauty of living in a free society.
Well, with the rise of Trump coming onto the political scene and rising to become the nominee of the Republican Party and then to become president of the United States, conservatives seemed to split. Mm-hmm. There were many conservatives, particularly in the national security field, who became what is known as never-Trumpers. And there were other conservatives who were ardent supporters of Trump, mm-hmm. not necessarily in every aspect of his character, but in terms of certain policies. Some might distinguish what are called the paleo-conservatives from the neo-conservatives. Right. And then aside from those particular schools of thought within conservatism, There's just the great majority of the Republican Party that seems to continue to support Trump. Even though today's headline in a conservative newswire was that Wednesday was Trump's first day as a Democratic Party president. So and it also went on to say, well, Trump has no ideology. Right. So is Trump a conservative? Is he a paleocon? He doesn't seem to be a neocon.
Right.
What is he?
What is he? I mean, it's a couple things come to mind.
And why do some conservatives support him and others
don't?
Not?
Yeah. To untangle that, something occurred to me as we were sitting here talking about geopolitics with Granary as a program. Right. Our first program was in January 2013, and we had Professor Jim Kurth on here to talk about the meaning and the future of American conservatism, and that was on the eve of Barack Obama's second inauguration. And the approach was, now that the Republicans had suffered two significant defeats and the conservatives appeared to be in retreat, what was going to happen? And so it was a sort of a diagnosis of the problem. So here we are 4 years later, right? The Republicans have won the White House, and yet we're still asking this same question, right? That the victory of 2016 has been almost as damaging to conservatives as the defeat of 2012. Which says something about, a couple things. Because it is true, right? Donald Trump is not a conservative. I don't think... he says a lot of things about himself, and so I'll let him say this about it. But Donald Trump certainly does not have a coherent ideology beyond what happens to serve the interests of Donald Trump. And I say that as a value-free judgment, right? I'm not. I think that guy's been awfully successful following the interests of Donald Trump. So he himself is not a conservative in any coherent way. However, a lot of conservatives embraced Donald Trump because they hoped he would do what they want, or because they hoped that he would embrace positions they would advance. And that's where his rise during the Republican campaign, he was so critical of the Republican establishment that certain conservatives who had felt like the Republican Party had lost its way embraced him, because here he was telling everybody the Iraq War was wrong, that immigration should be restricted, right? Various positions that the establishment Republican Party was on the opposite side of. And so some critical conservatives were like that, and this is something that can't be forgotten as well, is a good number of conservatives embraced Donald Trump because he made liberals so angry, right? And this is, I would say, is one of these issues about politics and the degree to which the frustrations of conservatives who felt like they who feel as though they are outnumbered in American society, were looking for a candidate who was just going to make noise and break things, which I would have to say is not is a very human reaction, is not a terribly conservative reaction, but there is some of that, and I think that's one of the reasons why we see the strong reactions to the image of President Trump making a deal with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer is frustrating for a lot of conservatives, because they voted for this guy because Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer didn't like him. So there is that difficulty, right? As a president who was elected not so much by espousing a coherent ideology, so much as offering a particular pose or perspective. So there's that. But at the same time, right, some people voted for him, some conservatives in the business world, other voters as well, they voted for Trump because they saw him as a businessman who makes deals, which is, of course, the opposite of having deal makers don't necessarily have an ideology, right? Deal makers just make deals. The frustrating thing there to remember is that somehow the ability to make deals it doesn't tell us much of anything if we don't know what kind of deals somebody wants to make. And that's where, to have somebody who has that combination of a guiding principle or series of principles and an ability to make deals, right? That's what you want. Right? So one of the criticisms of President Obama, was, while he had certainly the ideas, that he was never terribly good or interested in the nitty-gritty of making deals. Right? This is a criticism that came from members of the Democratic Party in Congress, came from lots of other folks. And so you have a president who says, I like to make deals. And it only took him 222 days in office to make one. But I think that's one of these interesting questions, is what did people think they were getting when they voted for Donald Trump? And so why did some conservatives embrace him and some conservatives reject him? I think that, and without being critical without being too critical of either side, we can save that for the Q&A. I think that conservatives who voted for Donald Trump partially because they felt as though the system needed needed the shock that Donald Trump as president would give it. The conservatives who did not support Donald Trump were conservatives who felt that the system did not need gratuitous shocks delivered to it. And the challenge is, once somebody is elected president, is then we have to decide how they're actually going to govern. And one of the challenges for the deal maker in chief is he has not yet been able to find the secret sauce that allows him to make deals that would pull together a larger consensus. And that's where the temptation that he faces is to govern according to shock and awe and upsetting the people who he can easily upset, which keeps the base very happy but does not advance any kind of larger agenda. And yeah, we can come back to that. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, we've mentioned the paleo-conservatives, the neoconservatives. The other new group is the alt-right.
Yes.
And Steve Bannon, before he entered the White House with Trump, he was head of Breitbart, which he described as a platform for the alt-right. And now he runs it again, now that he's out of the White House.
Right.
And at the same time, the alt-right is represented by the likes of Richard Spencer. Now, Richard Spencer, when he speaks before an audience, they raise their hands in a salute reminiscent of the salutes given for Adolf Hitler. Steve Bannon is going to be a keynoter at an annual dinner for the Zionist Organization of America this fall. So, what is the alt-right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in a sense, right? The alt-right called themselves that because they didn't want to call themselves white supremacists. I mean, Richard Spencer will basically tell you that they invent the term alt-right because they realize that calling themselves the things that they're called otherwise is bad PR.
But Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon called, and this is the interesting thing: is what is Steve Bannon attempting to accomplish by rallying the alt-right? There's a story about Steve Bannon's experience working in the gaming world, and this goes back to my ideas. It gave him a window into a large reservoir of especially sort of disaffected, disconnected young men. And while I can't look at anybody's soul, so but I'd like to think the best of people, right? Like a lot of imperfect people, I'm hoping for forgiveness and redemption. So I'll hope that for everybody I talk about tonight too. That Steve Bannon's approach was that demographic, these were people who were completely disconnected from politics, and the way to bring them into politics was by encouraging them to be sort of angry and aggressive, and to bring that aggression on. And so that's where reaching out to the alt-right was not necessarily because he was embracing the entire ideology of the alt-right, but it was because he saw it as bringing in these people. What I think we've seen in his brief period in the White House is there never was a very clear idea of we're back to this idea of, what exactly are you trying to accomplish with these guys, right? So you brought them into office, you've opened the door to these ideas, but what exactly are you going to accomplish with them? And I'm still very confused about this, right? The same Steve Bannon who was famous in 2014 for giving a speech at a conference at the Vatican about the need to protect Western civilization, today, when the Catholic bishops had the nerve to say they would like to see DACA maintained. He basically said in an interview that's going to be on 60 Minutes in a few days that the bishops did this because they need all those illegal immigrants to fill their churches. So basically he insulted the entire hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States so that he could make his anti-immigrant pitch. So I don't know how that's defending Western civilization. And we're back to the question of redemption. That's something Mr. Bannon will have to talk about.
Well, one of the things that Bannon uses to distinguish himself from others on the alt-right is what they may be white nationalists, he says. He describes himself as an economic nationalist.
And this is something I think that is fair and is actually, if there is something, there are valuable things that have been brought into the discussion by the Trump campaign and by Steve Bannon. And this, we need to give him this. And that is that there is a sense that for the Republican Party as an institution and for the conservative movement, after the end of the Cold War, so after that overarching sense of a global mission that held everybody together, we have this greater fragmentation. And the dominant force within the Republican Party, the dominant force within the conservative movement, is the small government, low tax, free trade, globalization elements of the Republican Party, the economic globalists, the economic universalists. And that argument, the argument for free trade, is rooted in notions of individual freedom, but there has always been the problem for, going back to what I talked about at the very beginning of the conversation, is if conservatives believe in community, we have to understand that capitalism is not a conservative force. Right? Good, bad, or indifferent. Right? Capitalism is not a conservative force. Right? Capitalism is disruptive. And for conservatives to simply say whatever the market does is good leaves open a very big question of, well, what if it destroys communities? What if it suddenly means that there are whole towns where there are no jobs? What if it means what does it mean when families are broken apart because of economic misery? And this is a question that I think, when you talk about what kind of conservative I am, I think conservatives have dodged for way too long by pretending that, don't worry, eventually we're all, a rising tide lifts all boats, we're going to keep increasing the size of the pie, right? All of the great cliches. Well, what happens if the boats don't rise? What happens if the pie doesn't get any bigger? Conservatives haven't had an answer for that. And what we see with Steve Bannon is sort of recreating a kind of conservative critique of global capitalism. Right? Because there are critiques of capitalism on the left, certainly, but a critique of capitalism that comes from a position of smaller towns in the United States, that comes from a conservative position. Those are points that need to be brought into our conversation. I'm not sure that Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump appealed to those sentiments, even though in office he has not really done anything or not done much to actually live up to them, and because the people around him, right, when he's talking about reducing taxes, right? There are still these open questions of what are you going to do to actually help these communities. But I think that this is a discussion that conservatives have needed to have among themselves.
So, in effect, you're saying that actually Trump, whatever one may think of him, he played a constructive role, and there was a logic to his winning the Republican nomination, in that unlike all the other Republican candidates, he was the only one who was addressing, in effect, the concerns of the man in the street rather than
I think that's true to a certain extent. I mean, there were other Republican candidates who gestured in that direction. Right? Governor Kasich of Ohio certainly, in a lot of ways, talked about similar things, but was not able. Governor Kasich wasn't able to gather the same amount of support, in part because he didn't wed his critique of capitalism with the kind of aggressive, build that wall, all the other rhetoric that Trump brought along with it. We could talk about, right, one of the problems I think for the Republican Party in 2016 and going forward is there's no good reason why 17 people should have been led to believe that they should be the Republican Party's nominee for president. Right? A sensible political party would have a system of vetting their candidates. Right? Even if we want to say Donald Trump is one of them, I mean, certainly he made more sense than a lot of the other people who were in those early debates. And if you have 17 people on stage, it's hard for anybody to get attention unless they are prepared to be as outrageous as possible. And so, the party created this problem for themselves.
Well, before we open it up to the audience, and since we are the Foreign Policy Research Institute, we ought to talk a minute about foreign policy.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm asking you, this is a kind of a big question. Can you characterize what the Trump foreign policy is, what a conservative foreign policy might look like, and what a liberal foreign policy might look like? And how are they all different?
How would they be different from each other? I mean, in a sense, right, and I keep making reference to the end of the Cold War, right? Before the end of the Cold War, you could imagine there was, from the 1940s to the 1970s, well, people talked about the Cold War consensus that more or less encompassed the large center swath of the electorate, right? It was in favor of the exertion of American power in order to advance our economic interests, but also to support our allies, to support broad notions of pro-Western, pro-U.S. governments. We began to see a fragmentation on the left of this consensus with the Vietnam War. And then with the end of the Cold War, we began to see a fragmentation on the right. That a lot of conservatives who were never completely comfortable with the idea of having to deal with allies all over the world, or who were looking for, who wanted to American power to be less constrained. These were the critics of American power who are what we think of as the paleo-conservatives, right? Paleo-conservatives are people who would trace their roots back to the 1930s, when it was a time to believe that there could be wars around the world, but the United States should stay out of them as much as possible. There's also the larger historical points made by Walter McDougall I'm blanking on his name, but my other colleague at Bard College and at the
Walter Mead.
Walter Russell Mead, thank you. The two Walters, who talks about the Jeffersonian, the Jacksonian, the Hamiltonian tradition. That there's a conservative element that's very Jacksonian, in the sense the United States should be strong, but not be constrained by any deals with anybody. Should strike against our enemies, but then pull back when we feel like it. So for a conservative foreign policy after the end of the Cold War has had to struggle with this question of pursuing national interest, defining those interests in such a way that respects the institutions that the United States has created or helped to create. And this is what I think is a conservative foreign policy would be one that would value the alliances that the United States has developed, value the international system the United States has helped to build, but could also look for ways in which the United States could rely more on its partners and less on having to take care of everything itself. That would be conservative with a small c foreign policy. That's also the foreign policy of a lot of liberals. Now, a liberal foreign policy might place a little more emphasis on the need for preserving international multilateral institutions like the UN, might put more emphasis on human rights. But I think even a small c conservative foreign policy could see those things as important. It's about that we can pull back from the excessive ambitions of the period 1991 to 2008. When we allowed the fact that we were the only superpower to let us think that we could solve all of the world's problems just because we wanted to. What I think, though, the Trump foreign policy suggested it was going to be was that it was going to pull back even further, in the sense of by defining American national interest narrowly enough that even existing institutions like the NATO alliance, existing institutions like the UN, existing institutions like the WTO, institutions like or even institutions that our friends belong to that we used to think were important, like the European Union, that somehow the United States could dismiss and diss all of those institutions, and that the world would be better off if everybody just pursued their own interest. That's what Trump suggested his foreign policy would be. His actual foreign policy since becoming president has been I'll upset him by using a French word, a mélange of both what he said his foreign policy would be and what a conservative foreign policy would be. Because there's a recognition that you can't completely walk away from all of these institutions, but you can emphasize American interest more. What we're waiting to see is, and this is where maybe there'll be questions about North Korea, what we're seeing the challenge is how well does a president who is more comfortable talking about American interest, how well is he going to be able to mobilize cooperative efforts among allies because you don't want to end up getting back into the same sort of unilateral problems that the neocons are accused of getting us all caught up into.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, we'll open it up to the audience. I would ask you to wait till the microphone comes to you and speak directly into the microphone. You're welcome both to ask a question, or if you wish to take issue with something you've heard, just try to keep it somewhat abbreviated. Does anybody have the mic already?
I have it.
Okay, you,
Okay.
you have that person right next to you. Yeah. It's hard for me to see anything.
I'd like to just maybe challenge you a bit on the deal maker
Sure.
versus ideological free,
Sure.
being ideological free. Because if you're a deal maker, you must find a way to make the deal stick.
Right.
And now that means at the domestic level, you need a functioning court system. And nobody knows more about courts than Donald Trump, from what I read. And
He certainly knows how to drag people into this. Yes.
And also you need an international system which will somehow support the deal that you've already made with another country rather than going to war.
Yes.
So in that light, do you have some opinion on where his ideology might be going, given that he wants to make deals?
I got to say, this is where to be as generous as is within my poor power to be. I'm waiting to see what he actually imagines a deal to be. And the DACA example is a good one, and I say that because this is that on the one hand, when he was campaigning and he knew what got the crowds going, and he is big on the adulation of the crowd, he would say, I'm gonna cancel that thing the first chance I get. But we see that when given the opportunity to cancel it, he still dithers. Right, that he says, I will cancel it if Congress doesn't do anything in 6 months, but then he sends a tweet that says, if you don't do anything in 6 months, I might do something different, right? So and that's where the lack of that clear, it's one thing to say to Congress, you all fix the DACA thing, but a president of the United States should be able to say, should have the confidence in what he or she was elected to do, to say, I want this. My supporters in Congress should try to do this. Now, if then, in the course of the debate and the discussion, then there's a deal that has to be struck and maybe you make changes around the margins, you do that if you're a deal maker. But you need to give people an idea of where you want to go. Like, we don't exactly know whether Donald Trump thinks DACA or some variation of it should continue to exist or not. We know that he sent out his attorney general to say it was rescinded. But we also know that the president seems to be completely open to something else being done in the next 6 months. So that's where a president has to be willing to come down on one side or another. And it's funny to say. I mean, here, am I suggesting somehow that Donald Trump is too cautious to come down? I mean, he doesn't come across as very cautious in a lot of his rhetoric. But in his actual policy decisions, he has been very reluctant to be as definite in policymaking as he is in speech making.
We have a question right here from Marina Katz, and then we'll go in the back there.
Thank you. I have two questions. One of them is, our form of government is really not a democracy, but a republic.
Yes.
That's what our founding fathers decided
Absolutely.
to have. And I think it would be very easy position for conservatives to say, we are a republic, not a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we are a country of laws.
Yes.
And DACA in itself is against our law.
Yeah.
I'm an immigrant, and I'm not necessarily saying DACA good or bad. I actually do believe that anybody who comes to this country should come legally. And if we pose this as not a Dreamers Act or the act of illegal immigrants who cross our border despite our laws, everybody would have a different view about what DACA is or any other forms of changes that we're trying to implement.
Yep.
So, and another thing is, I think that conservatives are running from the idea of republic and somehow is embracing the reality of democracy, which obviously is a first step to chaos. And we should not forget that, and I think if we are interested in conservative movement, we should be interested in promoting the interest of republic.
I couldn't agree more. When I talk about the need to preserve institutions, right, I think that's something that conservatives, American conservatives, or people who consider themselves conservative, whatever political grouping they belong to, have allowed their rhetoric to drift in a lot of, I think, very potentially problematic directions, right? A kind of hostility to losing an election, a hostility to actually sharing power, a hostility to the belief in the importance of the courts and of the laws, right? That yes, we are a republic. And the fact that the President of the United States 5 years ago was in a position where if he wanted to do anything about immigration, he resorted to an executive order because Congress simply was so paralyzed that they were not going to be able to vote on anything at all. That in itself was a catastrophe. And so in that sense, right, the argument that a real immigration policy would not be based on one president saying X and the next president saying, no, I take that back, but actually one that would be based on laws. That's something that you would think that conservatives should get behind. But we know that many conservatives, or sort of a subset of the Republican Party that's very influential in parts of our republic, have decided for a long time that it's better not to do anything at all than to actually get into regular order and run the risk of having to debate and discuss policy compromises with the other side. This is where the deal maker, and this is where, so who knows, right? When historians write about, the beauty of being a historian is, people say, I'm a historian, what do I think about today? I said, I don't know about today, but ask me in 15 years and I'll tell you why whatever happened was inevitable. But we do have a, will historians say in the future that this random spiteful act by the president, he wanted to upset Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, so he went ahead and said, yeah, what Nancy and Chuck says is great. If this turns out to be the beginning of a whole series of compromises that allow knotty political problems to be solved, historians will say Donald Trump turns out to be a fantastic president who saved us from the collapse of the republic. If, however, things continue to go in the direction that I sometimes fear they are going in, and we get to the point where the actual institutions of the republic are failing because people so distrust anyone who disagrees with them that they don't want to talk to them, then people will say that the Trump administration was the last step on the slippery slope to the collapse of the republic.
See, the beauty of our Constitution is it doesn't start with the Congress. It starts with the people.
We the people.
And I think we the people become now we the press. And we the press now lead us on the wrong path.
See, we have a responsibility as citizens to educate ourselves about how the government should work. We have a responsibility as citizens not to allow ourselves to be led astray by the angers and frustrations of the moment, but to actually think about the long-term implications of our decisions. We cannot expect our leaders to be better than we are. Right? We get the leaders that we choose to get. And so we need to ask, if we don't like what our leaders are doing, then we have to ask ourselves, why is it that people like this are becoming our leaders?
We'll go to a question back there.
European conservatism, as
Yes.
it emerged during the French Revolution, particularly in the writings of Edmund Burke. European conservatism entailed not only respect for tradition, but also respect for social and political hierarchy, and attachment to religious values as incorporated in organized churches. What I'd like to ask is, to what extent, if any, these ideas and these values continue to find resonance among conservatives nowadays, beginning with conservative intellectuals like Ron Guarnieri?
Well, I'd like to say that American conservatives, there have been a few particular efforts to try to sort of synthesize what American conservatism is, right? The famous, Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind in the 1950s, George Nash's The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America. Both excellent books if you want to talk about this. And that Burke is, in some ways, the beau ideal for a subset of American conservatives, right? Everybody kind of wishes that we had some Edmund Burkes in Congress to give great speeches that reform in order to conserve, right? A famous Burkean statement, right? Because Burke talked about that society needed to be built from the ground up, that it needed to be built on the little platoons of family and community, church and local society before you look to the upper levels of government to solve your problems. And so that belief that there is a value in preserving community, I mean, that matters a lot to me. Right? I'm a terrible person on a lot of things. I mean, I'm not pretending to be perfect or even intellectually consistent all the time. But the idea that that community should matter, and that means the communities, not just the communities that we choose, but the organic communities in which we move. So in other words, it's one thing to say, I like my community. My community is the couple dozen people who I regularly communicate with on Facebook. That's nice. But I should care about the communities that surround me because of where I live. So that means I should be interested in making sure there's good schools and good roads and all these sorts of things. Right? Burke would be in favor of all that. And I think that for conservatives who have spent the better part of the past 50 years criticizing the federal government because they felt like the federal government was getting too strong. And I think that, in some ways perfectly sensibly. But that if you focus on hammering away at the federal government, right? Ronald Reagan's quote, government is not the solution, government is the problem. If you're only banging away on that notion that the federal government is terrible, and you've allowed that to sort of bleed over into arguing that government is terrible, and that stability is terrible, right? That's the wrong way to go, and that's not conservative. And so conservatives should be thinking about not whether or not institutions are thumbs up, thumbs down forever, but how well are the institutions that we have inherited? How well are they doing the jobs they are set out to do? So we can debate whether where the level of taxation should be. We can debate what government should or shouldn't do to deal with particular problems. But we should have that debate within a notion that we can improve these institutions. Now, I'm going to take a step back here and throw out another conservative notion, though, that's important to remember, is that when people try to figure out what's the difference between a conservative and a liberal, right? One of the arguments that's often made is, as you pointed out, Professor Lees, conservatives they talk about hierarchy a lot, which works up to a point, but can be very dangerous in a free society because we need to think about on what basis do we have hierarchy. We don't want aristocracies. But for conservatives generally tend to be, and conservatism as a philosophy wherever it's come around, generally has been one that emphasizes human frailty and the weakness of the world, right? That the world might be able to get better, but the world's never going to be good, right? In the sense that there's no finish line. And so that a conservative approach to social problems is, we will continue this struggle, but we don't expect ever to completely solve the problems, right? Optimism is more of a liberal than a conservative trait. Now, that doesn't mean all conservatives have to be pessimists. Certainly doesn't mean all liberals are optimists either. But I think that if conservatives are serious about community, but also about humility and the natural limits of our abilities as human beings, that should make us careful about assuming we can solve problems once and for all. And it also should make us careful about thinking we can simply overturn institutions that have already existed, that we work within them. Goes back to the republic point.
Okay. Do we have another question back in the back there?
Thank you very much for putting yourself on the firing line. I find myself in that same position. I've leaned heavily towards conservatism even during my undergraduate years when it was very unpopular to do so, but I am a stalwart human rights advocate, and I find myself criticized by my conservative thinkers, and I've never been able to understand philosophically why. It seems that human rights positions are naturally conservative, and yet they're seen really as the bastion of liberal ideology, and I've not quite reconciled that. Well, I was wondering if you had any thought on that.
It's a good question, right? Because for a while in the 70s, conservatives embraced human rights rhetoric because it was something you could attack the Soviet Union about. But I do think that this is where, what I was just talking about conservatives having a sense of human frailty and human weakness and skepticism about the future can lead to a kind of cynicism about motivations. And that some conservatives, they don't like talking about human rights because to really talk about those kinds of rights would suggest that we have a responsibility to protect them. And they're shrinking back from that responsibility. Now, there's an irony there, too, right? As if we think that conservatism, once upon a time, maybe still, for a lot of people, is rooted in religious views. You would think that a view of the intrinsic value of all people as children of God should make you feel a moral responsibility for everyone. And once again, I think this is what happens is that it's sometimes easier to simply reject the idea of the moral responsibility by dismissing notions of human rights or larger values. It's easier to do that than it is to actually get down to the nitty-gritty of the question is, if I believe these values matter, what is expected of me to do about them? So that's where cynicism, there's a reason why a certain kind of hyper-individualist cynicism is popular among teenagers. Right? Because they just don't want to be told they have to do anything, so they want to believe that if the world, if I'm responsible for me, I do whatever I want. That's why they all read Atlas Shrugged. Most of us outgrow that because we realize that we actually live in a world where we have responsibilities to other people. And that's, I think, but that's not easy, right? Because it does mean we have to make choices. We can't do everything everywhere. And making those choices can be very difficult.
Okay, question in the back there? Yeah. John Liu?
Very much. First of all, congratulations to both of you for managing to keep this debate elevated and in good spirits. My question is as follows. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of deal making, it implies negotiating skills. And placing that in the context of the North Korean relationship, I was wondering if you could give us your opinions on what happens when the leader of North Korea is declared as stating, quote, we cannot negotiate, or Donald Trump is impossible to negotiate with, end of quote. Could you offer us your views and your comments on that?
I mean, the North Korea is a tough one, because we know that the president himself has also said, right, that the time for talking is over. Talking won't solve this problem. We've been talking for 25 years. But as of, I just glanced at my watch, right? As of now, at least we're still talking, which is good, right? Nothing's gone beyond that. But I think that this, the North Korea question is a perfect example of how, when we talk about making deals, they can't. The deals are not going to make the problem magically go away. That, in a sense, right? The North Korea, some things are true even if Steve Bannon says them, right? And Steve Bannon said there is no military solution to North Korea, and I think that's very smart, because when I gave my talk on 100 Days of Donald Trump at the Cricket Club earlier this year, I said that too. So one of us is brilliant for thinking that. But if we think of that as the case, right, North Korea is not going to vanish tomorrow, and we wouldn't want, and I can't think of anybody who would want the kind of destruction that a military conflict would bring over North Korea. So if there's going to be a solution to the problem in North Korea, that solution is going to be based on the international community managing this problem. Right? This is a chronic disease. This is not something that can be solved by some radical surgery. And that's where deal making comes into play, because this is a matter of, can the President of the United States get the UN, get North Korea's neighbors, get even North Korea involved in any kind of discussion about what it's going to take in order to maintain a peaceful status quo. So that's where deal-making skills could really come in handy. Not deal-making skills that are going to solve it once and for all, but the kind of deal-making that allows us to continue to live in peace. That's the kind of deal, that's the kind of art of the deal that any president should aspire to.
Okay, we'll take one final question.
We actually have one question coming in from our live YouTube audience. Stephen Thomas asked about the likelihood of a primary challenge in the next election and how that would be supported within the party.
I really wonder whether the Republicans whether there will be a primary challenge to the president. That's a big step, and I think a lot will depend on what happens in the midterm elections. I'm not, in general, right? I think of this for Republicans or for anyone who would like to see somebody else as president of the United States. I think that it is a mistake to imagine that there will be some kind of magical bolt from the blue that's going to save things, right? There's not going to be a revelation. And I'll say this now, and somebody's watching this in 5 years, they can tell me how wrong I was. I don't place a lot of faith or a lot of hope in investigations that are going to change things. Donald Trump will either be or not be president of the United States based on how people vote. So in other words, it depends on how people vote in the midterm elections in 2018. It depends on how people vote in 2020. I don't think that a Republican primary challenger will be able to beat Donald Trump for the Republican nomination in 2020 if he wants it. So what it will come down to is whether the Democratic Party is able to find a nominee who can rally enough of the country to defeat Donald Trump. They thought they had one in 2016 who could defeat Donald Trump, and we know how that turned out. But I don't think there will be a primary challenge that matters.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to bring this to a close. I have lunch with Ron every couple of weeks, and we talk about basically the same things each time, and it just goes on and never stops. And likewise, this could go on all night long, and we'd still be hanging around. So I appreciate the seriousness of the tone here, and both from Ron and from our audience, and there'll be more to come. The next session of Geopolitics with Granary, which Ron will host, is with Heather Sharkey, a Penn professor, on her new book on the history of Muslim, Christian, Jewish relations in the Middle East on October 10th. So hope to see you then, if not before. Thank you for joining us next time. Very good.